Hello, welcome back to the Brendan O'Neill Show with me, Brendan O'Neill, and my special guest this week, Wilfred Reilly. Will, welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me on. Glad to be back.
It's great to have you back on. The last time we spoke was 2 years ago, and I actually wanted to kick off with a fairly broad question, just leading on from some of the stuff we talked about last time. Last time we spoke, it was still really the aftermath of the BLM riots of 2020, the whole fallout from the George Floyd killing and the disturbances that shook America. And I wanted to just ask you how things are panning out now, 3 years later. What is the temperature like in the race debate, in particular in the US? Have things become a bit more calm, or are the divisions being intensified, entrenched in different ways? How do you take the temperature of the current discussion around the race question in America right now?
I mean, I think the temperature in the States is certainly down from kind of its frenzied peak. I'd be interested in whether that's true in the UK or in Europe as well. But I mean, if you're talking about 2020, 2021, I mean, there are a lot of things going on. George Floyd had been killed. There was a large amount, as the world knows, of race rioting going on. I mean, major cities like Minneapolis weren't quite burned to the ground, but there was extensive damage. The Lake Street Black and Asian business district in Minneapolis, I'm from Chicago myself, was in fact largely destroyed. And I believe Portland, you had 128 days of sequential rioting. And all this was going on in the midst of another panic, which was COVID-19. And I think you and I were both pretty lockdown skeptical. I mean, you wanted to protect seniors, but so a great deal of hysteria going on. I mean, in a large city like Chicago for at least a year, I mean, almost everything was either shut down or very difficult to access. I mean, you were ordering in restaurants using QR codes and this kind of thing. Entire classes in primary school were eating out of doors and whatnot. So it was a moment of peak hysteria. Nancy Pelosi and the Democratic leadership in Congress were wearing a kente cloth, which, if you know the history of slavery, is pretty ironic. But kneeling in the great rotunda of the Congress in front of the giant statue of Father Abe Lincoln and all this. I think we're obviously down from that. And I think that, I mean, when I'm in actual meetings where leadership decisions might be made, I think a lot of people know that what happened, that frenzy, was foolish. I mean, tulip bulb level stuff.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, we did live through a very historical episode of hysteria back then. As you say, it was the lockdown moment. It was the fallout from the George Floyd killing, or the George Floyd death. And there was this explosion of pent-up political, moral, cultural, and energy and angst that took place in America and in other parts of the world too. I wonder if, in relation to the hysteria, especially around the race question, and that exploded into physical hysteria on the streets of certain American cities in 2020, would it be right to say that the hysteria is no longer physical? It's no longer taking the form of riots or the dragging down of statues or the burning down of buildings? But it hasn't gone away. The hysteria rather has gone back to the place that it previously inhabited prior to the 2020 riots, which is in the academy and in certain sections of the media elites and in certain sections of the political establishment itself, where there still is this idea of America as a white supremacist nation. And white American cops are carrying out a genocide against African Americans. America is stained by the kind of original sin of slavery and probably will be for the rest of time. So we don't have that fiery hysteria that we saw in 2020, but it's still there being expressed in the seemingly polite but slightly unhinged perspective of sections of the establishment. So it's still kind of brimming there, isn't it, within the elites?
Well, I think that's a long-running problem. That's an endemic as versus epidemic problem. And I would say this is true throughout. I don't know about the West. My Spanish and French are quite poor these days, but certainly the Anglosphere. If you look at Australia with the endless sorry days, I mean, some of the things I've seen looking at the UK, Canada is insane. I mean, Canada went through a year of frenzy about this idea that I'm sure you've been following this, but the rural residential schools, I'm sure tough places for Native kids, some poor white kids, but that they were murdering children. That there was a graveyard of 300 bodies, 277 bodies at one of them. And I mean, this struck me as insane, but I'm partly of Native heritage. You never know. Initially, I took the story somewhat seriously, but the actual science press, the major journals, several of which I read, revealed pretty early on that what they found in Canada was not a set of bodies. They found just irregularities under the ground, which happens pretty regularly with LIDAR, ground searching radar, apparently. Those could be tree root bowls or dead raccoons or something like this. I mean, you don't want to make light of it. We have no idea what they are. So they just found a bunch of BS under the ground, assumed that there'd been a mass murder of these children, and spread that story. I mean, one media outlet and a couple of native chiefs who agreed with that take started saying this, and the entire country panicked. So I guess the reason I'm focusing on that is that I think throughout the Anglosphere, you have this issue, and I think it's a structural issue. I mean, if you've read any communist thought, frankly, Gramsci comes to mind. One of the ideas is that RIDs, quote unquote, are never going to be incredibly socially popular. They're never going to control athletics, sport. They're never going to control the military, although we're challenging that in the USA a little bit. But they're never going to control the farmers' organizations, the Grange or whatever. They're never going to control industry. So what they have to do is control the mouthpieces of discourse to make what are frankly fringe ideas, like some women have 9-inch penises, seem very common, right? Very popular. And we've seen that to a crazy extent. I think we're probably the worst on this out of the major nations I've mentioned in the States. But I mean, academia, obviously secondary education, print media, televised media, we do have an issue with these ideas being entrenched there. I mean, after the 1960s social revolution in the United States, there's a great book, Ron Radash's Commies, which actually breaks down this fairly organized pipeline from schools like Harvard and the University of Wisconsin. I mean, Kent State, I mean, places where people are fighting soldiers and there were deaths, across those two sides, but into the academy. And we've yet to dislodge those people. I mean, he's not exactly someone who's fighting at Kent State, but I mean, Ibram Kendi is considered one of the USA's leading academicians, leading scholars. He's a MacArthur genius, so those people are there. Yeah. I do think that we've decided to put a few more chains on them, though, at the level of the integrated institutions politically, like the judiciary. Affirmative action recently came up to the Supreme Court. A lot of people didn't even expect a decision in this case. But the judges, every conservative right-leaning judge essentially said, no, like what's been going on for the past 25, 30 years is absurd. The idea is that race would be used as a marginal factor among similarly qualified candidates, but that's not happening. I mean, the group Fair Admissions actually provided admissions data, which is difficult to get. So the judges were confronted by this reality of, 345-point test score differences between Black, and I will add Latino applicants, and Asian applicants, and some groups of white applicants at these colleges. And I mean, that process has been made illegal. Now, I think there's an end run around that. I mean, I know the colleges are going to cheat. But after the George Floyd panic, we've actually seen police departments in many cities not only bounce back from defunding, but increase their budgets. I mean, we saw the murder rate increase to something 20,000 homicides a year immediately after Floyd was killed. And urban leaders said, well, that's not sustainable. Or we're already a fairly violent, large country. So, I mean, that's been stopped in its tracks. Affirmative action has been declared against the law. We'll see how that policy takes place or is implemented. But I think that we have an issue with radicalism in institutions in America, but I don't think that that's a new issue. And I think, if anything, there's a lot of backlashing to it. People are realizing what happened under COVID, thinking it was crazy.
Here at Spiked, we're all about producing the best possible articles, essays, and podcasts for you to enjoy. And a major part of that is creating the visual content to go along with it. And believe me, that isn't always easy. There's actually a ton of behind the scenes work that goes into the aesthetics of Spiked, like designing our website, putting our ads together, or creating attention-grabbing social media posts. Plus, all of it has to be consistent with a Spiked look. When you're not a graphic designer, that is much harder than it sounds. That's why we're so grateful for Canva. Canva for Teams is a design platform that makes it easy for anyone to create stunning content in any format, whether it's a social media post, videos, presentations, or websites. Ever since we found out about Canva for Teams, collaboration on all our design tasks has become so much easier. With Canva, our whole team can work together in real time. The clear workflow means we can all discuss and see what we're working on. We don't need a bunch of windows or documents open at once. It's all there in one space. That is part of what makes Canva so easy to use, especially if you're not a professional designer. Canva lets you design pretty much anything. Like with Canva whiteboards, you can brainstorm with your team and get all their best ideas. And unlike a real whiteboard, there is infinite space to think. Once you're done brainstorming, Canva makes it easy to turn your inspiration into design. There is a huge free library of videos and audio tracks, so you can always find something that works for your ideas. And here's my favorite part, Canva's AI-powered magic features. If you're ever stuck for ideas, you can use the magic design tool to generate them for you. Just upload an image and AI will curate a collection of unique templates. Then you can customize them as much or as little as you like. It's a great feature for bringing to life what's in your head. So why not start designing and collaborating with Canva for Teams today? Right now, you can get a free 45-day extended trial when you go to canva.me/Brendan. That's canva.me/Brendan for a free 45-day extended trial. Canva.me/Brendan. I think that's a very interesting point about the restraints that are being put on certain elements of the kind of racial hysteria or you know, the woke hysteria, we might call it more broadly. You mentioned there women with penises as well as another expression of this. I have that same feeling. I kind of slightly flip between optimism and pessimism in relation to this, because there is definitely a movement against some of these ideologies. We have it here in the UK too. We're often referred to as TERF Island because we have so many TERFs here, so many women who are not willing to put up with some of the trans nonsense in particular. And we also have politicians of color here, as you do in the US, who are willing to speak out against the idea that Britain is a structurally racist country, that black kids and Asian kids and others will never do well in this country. It's provably not the case. So in relation to that, in relation to the kind of backlash or the hopefully the rise of sanity or the movement of sanity against some of these ideas, I did want to ask you about a piece you wrote for Spike recently, which was headlined "What Obama Gets Wrong About Race." Because one of the striking things for me about America is this contradiction between race doomerism on one side, which is quite pronounced amongst certain sections of the media establishment, in the academy, the Ibram X. Kendis of the world, the Robin DiAngelos of the world. There is this race doomerism. America is a racially scarred country and will be forever. But on the other side, there are some of the facts which you often bring to bear in these discussions. So in this piece, you talk about the fact that actually minority Americans are doing pretty well in terms of education and pay, which is quite surprising for a white supremacist country in which you have to be white in order to succeed. And you've also written at length over the years about the myth of a police genocide against young black men and the fact that some of these cases are more complicated than we first are made aware of. And also the numbers don't actually add up to a genocide or anything like it. So just speak a little bit about, well, some of the facts you raise in that piece for Spiked in terms of the success that minority Americans are enjoying and what you think that reveals about the truth of life in America in 2023 as against the image that we often get presented with.
Yeah, sure. I enjoyed writing the piece. I always enjoy writing for Spiked. Basically, we're talking about two narratives here. And the great thing about having two comparable competitive narratives is that in any of our fields, I'm a quantitative researcher, as an investigative reporter, as a numbers cruncher, as anyone intelligent, you can look at two narratives that are outlined this specifically and see which is true. And that's something I try to do in my writing. Narrative one is the Ibram X. Kendi, Robin DiAngelo narrative. I mean, we're both using the same names here. And essentially what these people think, this is rarely said, is the same thing that Stonewall Jackson thought. Like, America is a white man's country. If minorities try to rise, you'll have to show them the price of a white man's head. Ibram Kendi's book titles come from the speeches of Confederate officers. Stamped from the beginning is a line from Jefferson Davis. I guess not an officer at that point, president of the Confederacy. So, I mean, That's one take. And that to me is astonishing. When I found out that Ibram Kendi and Jefferson Davis spoke nearly word for word, I mean, I've always been a Lincoln guy myself. So that kind of really clarified what this is. And this to me is kind of this fringe narrative, at least since the 1850s. But that's one position. Maybe 1900s, but whatever, 120 years ago. The second is that the USA and similar countries are flawed, but that in any coherent sense, compared to highly civilized rivals like India or Mexico, it's in fact very easy to get out of your class clade here or, perceived racial block and succeed. I mean, and the empirical test of that would be, well, how do minorities do as versus whites? And what you find if you just go to Britannica or Wikipedia, CIA fact book, and look, I've used all three, and look up, list of U.S. groups by household income, you'll find that minorities do about as well as whites. I mean, of the top 10 groups, 7 are people of color. It would be 8 if you count South Africans, but I ethically don't. They've got too many whites. It's a mixed group. The populations that are coming from most of these places, Brazil in large numbers, are quite successful in the USA. Our most successful group is Indian Americans, then Filipinos, so on down the line. Whites do quite well. I mean, obviously, of course, Jewish Americans are a high income population. Australian Americans, somewhat surprisingly, in addition to drinking beer and sailing, the stereotypes we all have for different nations, make quite a lot of money. Many of them are in banking, almost $100,000 per family. So, I mean, in reality, what you see is this mixed picture of white and minority groups doing fairly well and competing with one another. And you can measure that. You can literally just open the encyclopedia and look at the list. So in the context of this actual reality, I've been puzzled by the prevalence of the doomer vision. My take on it, if I'm being dead honest, as a black man, is that it's awkward for Americans to say this because then you have to start asking questions about some structural failures in the black community. That's a simple reality. Now, blacks, by any global standard, are doing pretty well here as well. Average black household income is about $50,000, and we have a single motherhood problem. Black women are one of the most educated groups in the country. But to the extent that you're not supposed to criticize blacks at all, it becomes troubling to say, okay, well, there's a $15,000 income gap as versus whites. What could that be? Racism provides an easy explanation where you don't have to get into other issues, many of which, like single motherhood, are considered impolitic in the USA. So that, I think, is why the vision remains. But if you actually expand to a larger set of groups, like Caucasian Hispanics finish below blacks, from either, and I will note a hereditarian perspective as well, but from any of the standard sort of racial complaint views, there's no way to explain that. There are massive differences within white groups. So, I mean, if you take, Englishmen, and would be, I guess, descending, well, actually be Australians, Englishmen, Irishmen, Scots-Irishmen, and Appalachians, who are entirely of white, mostly British descent, you actually have about a $60,000 range in income, if I have that correct, from that very successful group at the top. And English Americans do quite well also, going down to Appalachians, who are one of the poorest groups in the USA. So that is explained by a lot of things. Again, single moms, the South is on average a poorer region, age, selectivity. People that come here from Australia now are probably very different from people that were shipped over here as convicts during the days of the British Empire and so on. So at any rate, you have to look at all of that. And that brings up some troubling issues about not just Appalachian communities, but black ones. So some people prefer not to. The reality is that you have to, though. If you have a problem, you want to fix it.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that's one of the important ideas that has come forth as part of some of this backlash against wokeness is just, let's talk about some cultural issues. Let's talk about beyond the race question and beyond trying to explain every inequality or difference in society as being a consequence of structural racism. Let's look at cultural questions, how people live, what families they live in. I think that's been such an important contribution to the, hopefully, the rise of sense in relation to some of these issues. I wanted to ask you, you mentioned there the success story of some minority communities in the US, which I think is a really important story to tell. And you've also mentioned earlier on affirmative action. And I did want to ask you about affirmative action. You wrote about that for us as well recently, about the Supreme Court's ending of the use of affirmative action in college admissions. Of course, it's the Supreme Court's undermining or its unfolding of affirmative action caused a huge controversy. We've seen columns and people screaming, saying this will be the end of racial equality. There's been a hysterical response in some quarters. But one thing I wanted to ask you about in relation to it was how unfair affirmative action was for some minority groups in the US, particularly Asian Americans, because it is just an extraordinary state of affairs where you have this successful minority community who are incredibly aspirational, particularly in relation to education. And they were being discriminated against, essentially, for being Asian American, for presumably being too clever, or for, I don't know, having cultural values that were too favorable to them. And therefore, they had to be taken down a peg or two. So isn't there an irony that what is presented to us as one of the great anti-racist initiatives of modern America actually was having a pretty racist impact on a section of American society?
Yeah, I mean, so first of all, what was being done to Asians in particular, whites were probably still, I mean, definitely still the largest group disadvantaged by affirmative action, and obviously it should be recognized. But what was being done to Asians in particular was insane. I mean, very much on par with how the major universities, at least in the USA, kept out Jews for, 150 years. The idea was sort of, this is a gentleman's institution. We don't want too many of you. So, I mean, there used to be these things, is your father in the trades? These totally random questions on the applications that were used to filter out people of the Hebrew faith. And today you see very similar things with Asian Americans. Are you dead? Harvard used what was called personality score rating, where they would make all applicants go through this sort of long, intrusive interview with someone not really affiliated with the school. And whatever you might think of that, apparently there'd been some kind of low-key instruction that Asians were to be rated below other people on personality. It was assumed that Asians would have higher SAT math and verbal scores, and that assumption was correct. I mean, if you look at just applicants to the university, the gap closed a little bit among admittees, but African-American applicants on each section of the SAT, according to Fair Admissions, averaged a 622, which isn't bad. But I mean, Asian applicants averaged about a 750. So you'd have this extreme dichotomy with a 1244 versus a 1500, at least in the admissions pipeline. Again, the people accepted were better on both counts. But the way that this was gotten around is that the interview scores for these Asian kids were set artificially low. And the Asian kids did not know that, as I understand, when they were applying until a year or two before fair admissions. So you'd absolutely kill it on the application process. You'd go into this long, punishing interview, and you'd come out and be told, and I think these scores were known, at least as students, that your personality was very poor. They just didn't think you had the personality for Harvard U. And this is a real thing that happened. You can Google Asian personality scores. So this was brought up as part of the case. And I think the reaction of many of the judges, especially Mr. Justice Thomas, was pretty much what my reaction was. Well, that's sort of 1900s level pure prejudice. How are they getting away with that? So that was one of the things that was really telling in the case, really potent to a lot of people, especially people who've applied to elite colleges, as I have, at least for law school, and who've gone through some of this stuff. I mean, the idea that it could all just be rigged. You weren't just being made miserable writing a 10-page essay and being, yelled at in this interview room. They were faking all of it to admit a certain number of blacks or whatever the case might be. I mean, that was pretty significant. But the broader point about all this is that the case was brought by Asians. And this, again, indicates something that people in the USA can like or dislike. But we are no longer a 95% Anglo-white country. Now, to some extent, we never were. Those figures that are cited by the online, quote-unquote, dissident right come from an era before we started counting Hispanics, for example. So, I mean, we didn't count Hispanics as a separate group until 1973. I don't believe they've ever been less than 10% of the population after that. So, I mean, you can play with numbers. You can have a lot of fun with numbers. But in reality today, the USA is 18% Hispanics counted as Hispanics, meaning they receive affirmative action benefits. It's 12% Black, and 7% Asian. The Native population has seen a real miraculous multiplication as, white nightclub girls started putting feathers in their hair over the past couple of years, in my opinion. But I mean, they're 2-3% Native now. I'm sure some of those people are genuinely 100% Native background. But anyway, when you're at that 60-40 level, what you very often find is that the people that are being cut out for these admission slots by members of underrepresented minorities are in fact themselves members of minority groups. And that was one of the major questions in the case. Even if you think affirmative action had a role to play when the primary U.S. minority was blacks and when discrimination was maybe 10, 15 years in the rearview mirror, Does the same policy make sense today when the largest minority is recent immigrants from stable Latin countries, and the people that they're beating out are recent immigrants from stable East Asian countries? Is there any logic there? And what the court decided was no.
Hi, it's Brendan here. I just wanted to remind you that you can still buy my book. It's called A Heretic's Manifesto, Essays on the Unsayable. And I've really been blown away by the response to it from readers, reviewers, Spike supporters. People really like this book, and I think you're going to like it too. It covers all the insanities of our time, from climate change hysteria through to COVID authoritarianism, through to the trans ideology. And it basically makes the case for more freedom of speech, more debate, and more heretical thinking to challenge the conformism of our times. So what are you waiting for? Go to Amazon right now and order my book, A Heretic's Manifesto, Essays on the Unsayable. And now, on with the show. Yeah, and there's another group that loses out, not as a direct consequence of affirmative action, but certainly indirectly, because one of the points you make is that affirmative action policies tended to favor already wealthy, highly educated sections of the black population in the US. So to the extent that it did a favor for African Americans, it wasn't for poor African Americans or those who don't have very high prospects of getting to Cornell University or Harvard anyway. So speak a little bit about that, because that is interesting, I think, because one of the things that has often struck me about the affirmative action idea in the US, it does seem to reproduce and protect the privileges of a kind of upper middle class section of black society. And it doesn't think about the broader economic problems faced by sections of the African American community, and also, as we said earlier, some of the cultural problems that might act as a barrier towards their movement towards higher education. So isn't there a problem with these rather elite mechanisms that favor those who are already doing pretty well, but don't do very much for those who are kind of economically underhill? And do you think that speaks to a broader neglect of class questions in favor of identity questions that really support an already privileged section of society?
Well, I mean, to go into a near conspiracy theory as someone who was a part of the Occupy movement and who saw that and the Tea Party movement broken in around 2011, 2012. I mean, I think that to a great extent, this kind of racial discomedy in the USA is promoted by elites of all backgrounds to prevent working class organization. We have a far less organized working class in the USA than is the case almost anywhere in Europe or indeed Latin America. So, I mean, I think that diversity can be used as a tool by the rich to kind of keep that going. And I'm not doing that poorly these days. I mean, you hear people say this from time to time. So I think that is very much a part of the background picture. If affirmative action were genuinely focused on improving the lot of poor people, a disproportionate number of whom, perhaps 40% of whom, are black in the USA, you could easily have economically based affirmative action. You could give the same, more than 100-point edge to students coming from genuinely disadvantaged neighborhoods, South Central Los Angeles and that kind of thing. And you'd get very much the same kind of 1,200 SAT scores from a mixed population of blacks, Eastern Europeans, Latinos, so on, that you're getting from black applicants alone these days. The colleges could have done that overnight had they wanted to. They didn't want to for a bunch of reasons. I mean, I don't think Harvard wants a bunch of quote unquote ghetto kids walking around, regardless of whether they're black or Assyrian or Vietnamese or whatever. I think there was an extraordinary prejudice against that happening. So what you had in practice was almost affirmative action as a sort of compromise between the white and minority elites. So there are admissions programs in colleges, which we're now also probably going to make a start toward getting rid of in the States, legacy programs, preferences for the children, not just of tenured faculty members, but of coaches, diversity deans, that kind of thing, a direct donor advantage that obviously do benefit whites, Caucasian Americans. On average, I mean, if your grandfather went to the University of Mississippi, you're very likely a well-off white guy. And in exchange for that, because black alumni of these institutions or even current black students never really attack legacy programs, I've never seen it on an organized level, minority elites were granted this other program, which provided, an advantage of several hundred points to the best black and Hispanic students. And the reality is that if you are looking at who's getting an SAT 1250 plus playing some varsity football, It's a bit behind the Asian score, but that's very rarely going to be the desperately poor son of a single mother or something like that. It's going to be the son of a Baltimore dentist. He's doing a little worse than the son of an East Asian New York dentist, but not by that much. So that's who you really saw benefiting from these programs. I mean, we're basically agreeing on this, but just as a final line, we measured this once, not myself, but Henry Lewis, Skip Gates, and a colleague looked at the breakdown of black students in the Ivy League in, I believe, 2004. And what they found was that about 2/3 of all black students were either literal foreign lords. They were the sons of like recent Nigerian immigrants, that sort of thing. They were from biracial families, or they were simply rich. I mean, families well above the six-figure mark. So when you look at black kids in the Ivies, it probably is those three groups, with a very, very small additional population, under a third, probably well under, of people that just strove their way out of working class neighborhoods like the white kids did. But that is a minority, and that's not what affirmative action has been promoting for the past 40 years at least.
I want to ask you about the culture of faking it, because some of the my favorite stuff of yours relates to people basically making things up. And it happens in two different ways. Firstly, there is race faking. You've written about race faking for us and for other people, where people adopt a certain racial identity, presumably in order to move ahead in precisely the kind of culture you've just described, where identity can be, certain forms of identity can be quite a rewarding thing to have, you know, in relation to moving up the ladder in the academy, or maybe securing certain jobs in certain fields. I mean, my favorite example is Jessica Krug, or Jess La Bombalera, as I think she falsely called herself, a white woman from Kansas, I think, who posed as a kind of Latino, Afro-Latino from the Bronx. But then there's also the faking it in relation to actual members of minority groups who claim to have been subjected to hate crimes, physical assault on account of their identity. I mean, the famous example is Jussie Smollett, but you've written about many other examples where people have basically invented a story of persecution and oppression, presumably in order to bolster their position in certain discussions in certain fields. They're two slightly different things, but just tell us a little bit about why you think it is that people are willing to fake an entire racial identity, or to fake a physical assault, which is a pretty serious thing to do as well. Does that speak to the stranglehold that identity politics in particular, and the hierarchical system that it nurtures, the stranglehold that it has over certain areas in the kind of cultural sphere, I guess?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, just as there used to be an advantage to nobility in many societies, or just to very high performance, there's currently an advantage to victimhood. And what that means is that a lot of people are pursuing victimhood, whether it exists or not. I mean, one of the loopholes in this affirmative action case that was just decided by the court, fair admissions, is that even the conservative justices said, well, we're not cruel. You know, if you've had a personal experience with racism, even if this means dozens of essays to a particular university, we don't really see how we can say you can't cite that as part of your admissions package. And the dissenting opinion just openly says, well, if you are a Black or Hispanic applicant, you should just describe your experiences with racism. And the assumption, of course, is that every Black or Hispanic student has a tragic experience with racism, such that that would be the thing you would focus on in a college application essay. And of course, that's not true. But I think what you're going to see is, for at least a couple of years, almost the same rates of minority admissions as people make up these terrible tear-jerking stories. Basically, I've never told anyone this before, but a group of white men at a party, this kind of thing. Yeah, I don't really know where to take that. But if you give a measurable empirical advantage to people based on something, they'll want it. And in the case of some of the writing I've done, like Hate Crime Hoax, obviously the book is the biggest example of this. But I decided to look at how common this was. And what I found, I mean, my initial data set was 409 hoaxes as I define them, mostly concentrated within about 5 years. You can debate what percentage of the overall chunk of hate crimes in the USA that constitutes and so on. But I was able to demonstrate pretty conclusively this isn't some rare isolated phenomenon. And the race fakery that Spite started writing about and asked me to look into, to write about, is obviously these people aren't claiming felony crimes, but it's kind of an adjunct of this. So like the Jess La Bambalera story is one of the funniest things I've ever written about. Yeah, it was a Caucasian woman from Kansas that started presenting herself as kind of an Afro-Latino party girl type, wearing these bright colored flower printed dresses and speaking with this exaggerated Spanish grandmother sort of accent if you watch telenovelas and so on. And this worked for years. Apparently she was quite popular. She's a funny person. She's a good dancer. La Bambalera refers to salsa, I believe. But people eventually started pointing out as she got better known, hey, that's Jess Krug, who, went to blank high school and played some basketball. Like, I know that person is not actually from a Dominican slum. Why would anyone pretend that? Well, because you became an academic as notable as La Bambalera did quite easily. I wouldn't imagine that Jess La Bambalera's, scholarly articles were necessarily held to the same criterion as Jessica Krug's would have been, journal to journal. So anyway, not infrequent. The reason for this is that it does give you an edge, a perceived edge sometimes, a real edge sometimes. I mean, we forget how serious this can be. I mean, Elizabeth Warren taught in the Ivy League for decades and essentially presented herself as a Native American Indian. I mean, 50% or whatever the case might be Native. She contributed a published recipe to a book called Powwow Chow, put out by the Native community in the United States. The funniest thing about this, by the way, was that it was clam chowder. So like there were clues all along that this is an upper middle class white woman from the coast. But saying she was not gave a massive career advantage. She became a serious candidate for president, so on down the line. You're now seeing this with people that are just a little bit more ethical with things other than, I'm half Indian. Although that's in practice uncheckable at most colleges. They're not going to make you take a DNA test. But the more popular version today is claiming you have some hyper unusual sexual identity. So, yeah, I mean, we've I'm sure both seen this data, but like in the Ivy League recently, they asked what percentage of students consider themselves queer or non-straight. And if I have this correct, at Brown, it was 38%. Yale, 35, Cornell, 33. And that doesn't mean 38% of people are gay. That would actually be an existential threat to human survival. It means that 38% of people have had a dorm room threesome while in college that involved both sexes, or they're just attracted to pictures of both sexes, or they're something like non-binary, which doesn't require you to do anything except reject some gender stereotypes. So that seems to be the path more people are going down. I mean, here in Kentucky, pretty good school, but in one of the more rural states, I mean, we're started getting the first wave of NB students and that kind of thing. And no one's personally abusive to them or anything like that, but you understand why this might go on among people beyond that tiny percentage of individuals who actually have real gender dysphoria.
Yeah, absolutely. And what was very striking about the Brown survey in particular in relation to sexuality is that actual homosexuals are now a minority of the LGBTQ. I think it's 22% or 23% at Brown of the LGBT student body are now gays or lesbians. The rest are bisexual, non-binary, pansexual, questioning, other. I mean, they make them up on the hoof pretty much. But as you were saying, outlining those things, it brings me to my final question that I have for you, Will, which is about the backlash, about the wished for return of some common sense to these discussions. And I did want to ask you a future orientated question about that, about how you think things will pan out in relation to American government itself, particularly in relation to the Democrats, I guess, the Biden-Harris administration. It would be remiss of me not to ask you how you think that's going. But in relation to some of the questions we just discussed, it's interesting that someone like Jessica Krug, Jess La Bambalera, would be seen as a complete fraud by the majority of people, someone who had culturally appropriated another identity and faked a race, and that would be seen as a bad thing. But at the same time in the US and in the UK, it's seen as perfectly acceptable for a 6'2" bloke with a beard and a penis to say, I'm a woman. And in fact, if anyone says you're not a woman, you'll be denounced as a transphobe and a bigot. And I was thinking about that in relation to Biden and Harris, because I'm sure those two have enough common sense to say that Jessica Krug is not an Afro-Latino woman. But Kamala Harris does write letters to that young trans girl whose name now escapes me.
Dylan Mulvaney.
That's right, Mulvaney, writing to Mulvaney to congratulate him on 365 days of being a girl. So it's a kind of contradictory situation, isn't it, in relation to wokeness, I guess, or identity politics, where sense does seem to be emerging in some quarters, but at the same time, it's been undermined in other quarters and on other issues. So looking forward, do you think Biden, Harris, the Democrats, that wing of the political establishment, will they come to their senses on identity, or is it likely to get worse in the short term? What's your perspective on that?
I think at some point they are going to have to come to their senses. A lot of the left parties, not just in the USA, but the West, have been looking hopefully to demographic change as this kind of path toward eternal socialism. And what we're seeing, and for me as a brown-skinned businessman, I'm pleased to see this, is that most of the actual immigrants we're getting, Nigerians, Caucasian, Mexican guys, and I don't care really what people's ethnic background is, but it is worth noting that 66% of Hispanics roughly identify as Caucasians of Spanish descent. Very proud of them, Aztec background as well and so on. But these are basically hardworking Catholic immigrants. I mean, there's going to be an assimilation process that may take generations, as there was with Italians, Irish Americans, so on. But the assumption that people are going to come here from Ciudad de Mexico and believe that, as I said earlier, some women have 9-inch penises, I mean, that's turning out not to be true. So the idea was that we're going to let in all these immigrants, and I believe this, and there actually are books about this, like the emerging Democratic majority. There's no conspiracism here at all. But the idea was we're going to change the population a bit, and then politics are going to change. And when you actually look at the immigrants that qualified to pass the U.S. citizenship boards and enter the country, I mean, you're talking about Muslim Arabs, Hispanics in large numbers, high-performing Asians, high-performing West Africans, Jews of all backgrounds. And in general, they're saying absolute no to that. So I think that they kind of they threw the pitch as fast as they could, thinking that this would be the thing that would get all of these ideas through the pipe. And I mean, Barack Obama, again, said this very, very openly. He used terms like coalition of the fringes. And his idea was that this union of kind of white, college-educated, wine-drinking women and minorities of every kind would smash through the patriarchy, and you'd get gay rights, trans rights, like everything in one block done at once. And it turns out that the majority of legacy black and white and so on Americans don't want anything to do with this. And the majority of incoming immigrants, if you look at how Hispanics are polling, Muslims are polling, don't want anything to do with this. So will the Democrats be shocked back into reality? I believe so. And just as the Republicans were in the 80s, by the way. I mean, so there's a split in the Democratic Party now between people who lean left. I'm thinking of some union iron worker friends of mine who are Italian American or from Chicago. Hey, why can't my wife get better health care? They manage that in France. I mean, there's that kind of basic perspective. And then there's the ideological political left. And when we saw this in the Republican Party, I don't know if you remember this coming from across the pond, but you had the moral majority kind of Christian approach very heavily in the U.S. in the 80s. Most Republicans, I sometimes vote Republican. That's the traditional business party. Most Republicans are guys that know how to tie a tie, that are interested in paying fewer taxes and winning wars if we have to fight them. But for 15, 20 years, you had a conflict between that bloc and a group of people that perhaps thought that government's instructions came from a place higher than President Reagan's podium and the world was going to end fairly soon. And in order to remain a viable national party, most of the initiatives that came out of that bloc, like a ban on abortion 4 weeks in, had to be quashed. They were not viable. The Democrats, I think, have a similar split now between the ideologues I've broken down and the majority of working class people in the country. People who know what a union jacket looks like and who have some interest in healthcare, road building in rural areas, that kind of thing. The trans issue, I think, is going to be a real wedge where the party's going to have to pick pretty damn soon. The whole idea that, how to phrase this reasonably politely, the idea that you can be a male who's visibly male and has a penis and just say you're a woman, which is actually, yes, I see it's absolutely crazy. Your heads are being shaken here, mine as well. Yeah, that's not something people are going to believe. So the insistence there are times when you should use this polite social fiction, but that TWAW, trans women are women, the chant used against quote unquote TERFs, the percentage of black people that believe that is about 29%, or that are even willing to say it on a survey. I don't think anyone believes it. Southern whites, 21%. Those are both heavy Democratic voting blocks. I don't even know if anyone's polled recent Hispanic immigrants on that. You might get into a scuffle if you start asking some of these questions. So just that, the Democrats can either in one sentence cling to that, the kind of fourth wave feminist vision and so on, and try to move forward with this intersectional agenda, or they can put that on the shelf. I'm sure there's still people in the GOP. I like Matt Walsh fine as a guy, but I mean, I'm sure he would favor a 6-week ban on abortion max, probably 6 days. I mean, but that is no longer the promoted agenda of the party. And that I think is where the Democrats are going to go. They'll say, well, of course, we support gay and polyamorous rights in all situations. And for at least the first of those, I'm probably on board. But that's not going to be the plank that leads the party. There's going to have to be a focus on, student debt relief might be something for the next president. Healthcare is always an obvious objective for the left in the USA, so on.
Will, thank you very much.
Well, thank you for having me.